I wanted to consume some new and different games recently, but I ended up dumping 40 hours in less than a month into another RTS, so oopsie poopsie. But to be honest, it makes zero sense. Long game, same genre as something I just played, western as hell, and fairly new. It's the opposite of what I wanted to play next, but it was perfect for what I needed. You see, Spellforce isn't just a real-time strategy game. It's also a CRPG, used as classic RPG in reference to tabletop RPGs because computer RPG is a hella dated term. Basically, it's like Baldur's Gate, Divinity OG Sin 2, PoE, and no, not the Diablo one, but the new League is kinda fun, and games like Pathfinder. Spellforce is a unique hybrid, forming a unique formula of RTS RPG, the real-time strategy role-playing game genre, which is a mouthful. So to dip my metaphorical toes into the water, I started with 2, actually, and then a whole lot of life shit happened, and I had to swap over to starting fresh with 3 instead. My messy, busy life actually did me a favor here by stopping my deep dive into 2, because chronologically 2 and its DLC is the end of the timeline, and 3, funny enough, is the prequel. So I lucked out by blindly jumping into a newer, nicer title. I get to witness the series in a very awkward but linear fashion, plus 3 was mad accessible, so it was an instant W. To call what happened thereafter a spiral effect is accurate. I was clocking in crazy hours in short periods and had a true anticipation to play. I was excited for weekends to binge it. I played a little after work every night for a couple of weeks. I was earnestly eager to experience both its play and expansive narrative every day until completion. If you don't know, now you know. I'm a diehard Dota addict, or at least was. The itch comes and goes for that top-down, Warcrafty Blizzard hero experience, and I still had some RTS cravings after AI War 2, featuring plenty of customization, progression, and micro-macro interaction for entertainment. Furthermore, the series is turning a round 2 decades old this year, and even brandished a new entry with Conquest of EO. It's a great time to celebrate becoming and or being a fan. There's plenty of history to explore, and new fresh takes being invented in the present. It just feels like the right time to start and play. Moving on from introducing Spellforce, I need to tackle introducing Spellforce III. As I mentioned, it's a prequel taking place before the cataclysmic events of the first and or second. It predates the world's big inciting incident and depicts a unique time in the world of AO. Beyond the prequel premise being enticing, it's also backed up by the series' previous work, and is full of world building and lore for it. It's a modern addition to the trilogy, still participating in the grander plot, but with better graphics, acting, and design. Spellforce 3 takes place in a Tolkien-esque world, high fantasy in every aspect, but tonally it's more than capable of matching Tolkien's darker scenes, with less transcendence and more grounded conflict almost outside of morality, but just not quite. It's honestly the best starting point for unfamiliar RTS fans, or newcomers to the series. The toolset and hotkeys provided are functional, the races have archetypical niches, and the present accessibility options alleviate frustrations with some of the game's problems, and for non-RTS veterans, there is an easy mode, which I did have to use on a few maps. Spellforce 3 is a honestly phenomenal game. Despite its prequel status, it uses this instead to bolster its writing to impressive magnitudes. It has over a decade of design, growth, and innovation behind it. Spellforce III Reforged oozes quality with sound and visuals, with simple but effective loops to play, and impresses with its writing even against the CRPG contemporaries with its twist and complex themes. It's the culmination of the best of both worlds, but it isn't perfect. It succeeds on its ambitious and innovative origins because that individuality is realized best when paired with lineage and the ambition to modernize it without compromising integrity by overly streamlining it. It's a fine line to ride. And to note, I haven't played the other titles or their DLCs extensively, but the jump in quality without abandoning the idea behind the older entries is damn impressive and deserves some praise. To get started, if anything stands out from the get-go first, it's the immense quality, the budget on display. The scale is immense, the ambience and OST working in perfect tandem mouse. The textures are surprisingly detailed for how much is on screen and with how far out the player's perspective sits. The portraits are honestly just alright, and the VA, at least for the main cast, is spot on. It's not perfect, but damn good, and defo surprised me. Take the opening scene of the game, for example, the first mission. Sentenza and his men in a dark campfire-lit forest, featuring an elite party of experienced veterans and the standard military men guarding the camp, further paired by creepy crawly spiders as initial tutorial enemies. This first scene is spectacular and sets expectations for the rest of the journey instantly. The general vibe I receive is that each map feels meticulously made, as if it was crafted in a map editor like from Age of Empires, for example. However, it has an academic touch. Imagine taking that unlimited freedom and accessibility to craft, paired with trained and taught hands, molding each event, encounter, and general workflow. It's like those same old creators practiced and studied their way onto the studio, or are veterans of the studio and series. Not to mention, one of the first voices the audience ever hears is Doug Cockle, our favorite Witcher.
Good. I've told you before and I'll tell you again. This mission is important. The man inside that fortress, Isamu Tahar, he's more than just an ordinary lawbreaker. He's a traitor, he's a mage, and he's a murderer. We are the best the Royal Army has to offer, and the Queen put her faith in us. So let's not fail her.
Now representing General Sentenza Noria instead of Geralt, the game's got monstrously strong first impressions. Statically, it's gorgeous for 2017, or in the remake's case, Reforged 2021, it is a picturesque masterpiece. But kinetically, it isn't always top of the line, quality for sure, but not perfect. It's not on the scale of Total War, Warhammer 1, 2, or 3, with its mad sense of scale, or its hundreds of diverse animations and units on display. It doesn't achieve that impossible sense of scale. Personally, many units are functionally similar, and even including those, there isn't enough diversity in the several armies. Between the first three factions, it's a little lackluster, which hurts the visual appeal and warfare fantasy. It really falls flat compared to the other champions of the genre, and weirdly enough, falls flat compared to the enemy faction in its own game, which features impressive variety comparatively. It is not a compliment to say I wish I could play the rival faction because of its abundant presence of choice. So for three factions and in a game that's this visually impressive, it is mad disappointing it lacks so much diversity and contrast in its unit library. However, many RTS games struggle with achieving a sense of living units. There's an issue with repeated or overly similar animations, especially for attacks, that make each soldier feel robotic like the unit they are in most RTSs. But in Spellforce 3, they personify their data, they give it a little life, and make each unit feel like a character participating in a war. I wish they were more visually distinct. Optimally, a unit type should have little variances to better emulate reality. But overall, these soldiers lack variety and diversity even between their factions. But they are pretty, they fit the setting, and they're well animated. So for all my complaints, they're actually quite effective, but feel poor compared to the world and its detail. And with themes as dark and real as Spellforce 3's, any visual representation will easily swing the tone to a darker place. The world, Ao, feels like it's dying. It's full of conflict, lost civilizations, hate, and forgotten golden ages. On the surface, it presents as high fantasy. There's magic everywhere, monsters, and typical Tolkien elements. Yet there's war and anti-magic sentiment, demons and devils ready to corrupt the world, blood and gore, disease, death riddles the road and streets, and just a whole lot of very human evil is inundated over Io. It earns its ESRB rating of M for mature, and I'm glad for it. Alongside the darker Tolkien tone, it makes an effort to cover the world's geography. Diversity is important in everything, and setting is no exception. Forest, jungle, desert, marsh, mountain, wasteland, and more are all featured. And that's not even mentioning the stone-cold gray interiors with castles, jails, fortresses, dungeons, and more. Significantly less interesting than the outeriors, but, still additive to the sum. I love the setting and tone. The design and diversity couldn't have been much better without some Elden Ring level landscapes and architecture, and unfortunately this isn't a Game of the Year contender, so it'd be rude to expect it. And last but not least, when it comes to aesthetics, the VA. I already mentioned our Witcher friend, but again, it's impressive from the get-go. It's an awesome standard to set, with Geralt at the forefront, and I have no complaints. The primary party members all excelled with their emotions and delivery. I'll note that the protagonist felt a bit flat at times, but was capable of strong, angry emotions, and more likely than not, was capable of better and was just holding back for an unknown reason. He still performs well above my expectation, but I could feel the character may have been what was holding the performer back. And other than that, there were some odd performances in the unit actors, but it played partly into the nostalgia trope of goofy VAs in the old RTS games. At a certain point, good or bad, RTS VAs are more concerned with being iconic than anything else, and to that, they do well.
She's ready to fire. Commander, would you like to push for a change?
Moving into gameplay, there's a lot to discuss. The 2-decade-old format from 2003 that combined RPG and RTS into the hybrid it is today still feels fresh, new, and innovative. Spellforce's flavor of it is admittedly difficult to shake, especially with each game being so diverse from the last major entry. 3 specifically is adapting the old formula to a more modern setting, and with another new developer, Grimlore Games, a subsidiary of THQ Nordic, and I'd say their style of gameplay works. Truthfully, it fucks. So I've touched the premise and I've waxed and waned past what's necessary about history. So how or what is the gameplay? It's basically Warcraft 3, coming from someone too young to play Warcraft 3 on release. It's a hero real-time strategy, meaning think StarCraft with a heavy emphasis on heroic or super special characters alongside expendable little gremlins. Leaning on the heroic elements, it can be related to older RPGs, the Western tabletop kind of CRPG, and while this is a computer game, regardless of its availability, I'm using CRPG as classic RPG, as in D&D TTRPG. So, play is divided between the adventure or hero segments for a small party of heroes, or between the war RTS segments, and sometimes they're both integrated into the same map and have these fun transitions between. It's a combination with a shared isometric perspective and control scheme, and pairs well to spice up the gameplay with its variety. The CRPG or RPG elements are entertaining because of gameplay mix-up and their difference in power compared to the average Joe unit. Every character has multiple class trees to invest in, with passives, actives, and flares, and general massive impact. On top of that, there's equipment, which can have game-changing unique passives and stats to add levels. Combining micro, abilities, equipment, and progression with stat increases and level up creates an Avengers-esque appeal. The power fantasy behind your A-team is compelling because of customization and power scale. And in a case of show don't tell, my 4 main friends were all pretty badass. Gore, my orc shaman, or Shaman as he put it, was my go-to ranged DPS. He paired powerful pyromancy with potent AoE and single target spells, with plenty of utility in his wide array of spells, with his undead summoners being the standout favorite. Plus, his wise and might make right attitude added a lot of grumpy old man energy to the party, with a spice of orc lore, which I liked a lot. Iana, the assassin sent to kill you, Dreamweaver, and dual-wielding Dex Spear Queen, melee burst DPS built around crits, bleeds, and AoE spins to wins define her. Her deadpan, emotionless, sympathetic sociopath vibe, and just solid backstory make her an amazing addition. Her text flavor came in logical, almost cruel efficiency, and mind-reading Dreamweaver powers definitely added some flavor text. She was pretty rad. Next was my flex role featuring Uram, the demonologist who functioned like Iana but with more strength, lifesteal, and magic, and Angar, my aura bot and tanky boy, both bringing tons of character with full lawful Angar and Uram's antagonistic powers everything personality. And me, myself, and I, Tahar, the charismatic paladin tank, abusing light magic and passive auras to robustly reinforce the rest of the party and the average militiaman. Paired with regen armor, a shield that heals on block, and just other bullshit, I ended up being a reliable, albeit low DPS, unkillable hero. Heal and resurrect are just broken abilities. And admittedly, the classes can be a little vanilla, but there are standout spells and archetypes that can be built to make up for it, and the flare more than makes up for all of it with the visual power behind those capabilities. That all being said, dungeon delving is also fun. Side quests can be MMO crap or actually good writing and fun gameplay. The moment-to-moment CRPG gameplay works well. What dopamine that does come from looting chest, quest, and bodies is enough along with feeling powerful to satisfy. But in comparison to the strategy within Baldur's Gate, Divinity OG Sin 2, and Pathfinder, it can fall short, but it's also not the genre in focus. Spellforce III's RPG passes, but it isn't the full picture. There's room to grow. Alongside being a role-playing game, Spellforce is also a real-time strategy game. The RTS segments are notably standard, very functional. The typical loop exists. The player starts within HQ or capital, and uses given workers to expand their economy through the construction of buildings. This economy then turns into offensive and defensive units and structures, or more economy. One of the unique RTS elements of Spellforce is the outpost system. The player and enemy can only build where they have an outpost, only use workers in that outpost, which comes from upgrading the outpost, and the outpost upgrades are locked behind resources and the capital's upgrade level. It creates a game flow of geographical expansion to facilitate resource and economic expansion to expand military power. It's king game design and reminds me of Dawn of War 2's system, but done better. It capitalized on this developer manipulation of strategy because players can't build anywhere. There's no Protoss player building turrets next to your workers and HQ's T-strat. It regulates play, but overall, for the better, by removing exploitation opportunities, and at least in versus, add strategy, because in exchange for that freedom, it creates new decisions and objectives for both players surrounding outpost play. After expanding and mustering an army, the player must go out and seize the day. The objective of every map can differ, but are most like the player's fail states. The two fail states given on most maps are if the player's capital dies or if the player's party is wiped out, it's game over. Now the player's party has respawn points that are recharged over time, but the moment an ally, a hero, is ready to respawn and there's no point to spare, it's GG's. Conversely, the opponent's heroic units or bosses simply need to be killed once. However, expect major villains to retreat and suffer from the Fire Emblem trope of retreating repetitively enough to fight some bosses 5 or more times. It's not as bad as Fire Emblem, but for the major villains, expect to see too much of them. Unfortunately, that's hardly the end of the game's issues. The simplicity, the sense of classic RTS and RPG have consequences. I'm speaking specifically for the campaign. Any multiplayer problems are beyond me and my experience. And maybe it's just me and my ineptitude with the genre, but the AI, the balance, and the stripped gameplay loop were major hiccups for me. To start, the AI was piss poor. The issue is multiplied because of limited player options. I have control over them, But the issue surfaces the moment I look away from any unit. To summarize, there are two behaviors an AI can have. The default is aggressive, aggro makes them chase as long as the unit is alive and in vision, and defensive, which only allows for counterattacks when visible units attack them. It's about self-defense. The follow-up issue is that the game director, the enemy campaign AI, is a computer capable of micromanaging their units and abusing behaviors. It will draw aggressive units away, potentially to their defensive outpost, or away from defenses and allies that could have helped them. Or, and honestly more annoying, it will attack units just outside of vision range that are defensive, and that unit will not react, nor will any of its nearby defensive allies, even if those allies can see their buddy getting smacked, react. The other major problem of poor AI is the limited number of commands. As I said, I have control over these units, but lack necessary tools. Commands alleviate micro-intensive play. A great example is Supreme Commander's patrol function, which allows my unit to walk a route I define. They patrol that area. Spellforce III has follow, wait, move, and I think something simple like stop. It's extremely limited and therefore limits me with a demand for overwhelming micro. Other games have better AI, more commands, and more behaviors to prevent easy exploitation. This level of micromanagement doesn't feel skillful. I should be ordering my control groups around, assigning tasks to them and a slew of commands, and expect them to handle it, while I control my main party, which demands and expects more micro, especially because they're a given fail state. More commands, behaviors, and better AI would have resulted in more meaningful choices and better strategy. Micromanagement has one plus side, only one: consistent and demanding engagement. The player is always doing something because of dumb AI. But if I had the choice over prioritizing strategy or engagement, I'd opt for strategy, especially when I could have been more engaged with my heroes instead. Another major issue presents with the campaign's balance. Said quick, 3D printer bullshit, and better units and unit variety in the opposition. The main antagonist, the second half of the game's dominant faction, has a greater library of units to pull and better units to pull. What were bosses become common enemies, at least towards the game's end, and it starts to destroy the pace and fun. Chewing through several or a dozen boss-like units consistently and for far too long isn't fun, even if it is an excuse to combat party player balance. I have 4 complementary heroes dependent on each other. The enemy has an army. It's especially annoying because only a few 2 to 4 maps allow Tahar, the player, to use the full roster of all 3 factions. If Tahar could use all 3 factions, if the player could pull from all 3 factions, unit diversity and many of the game's issues actually would be solved. Otherwise, it feels like you're using a second-rate army no matter which faction is selected to combat your foes. It is quite annoying. The bigger issue with balance is the 3D printer aspect. The enemy isn't limited by in-map player-affected economy. It feels like a game director operating within a set of rules. It feels bad. The player and enemy operate under different rules and create a distracting and annoying valley of difference of play between the two. The enemy will harass and pull defenders due to poor AI, print units including elite boss equivalent units, and ignore the player's decisions. Instead, it appears the AI play along a designated path with little variance or reaction on normal. Furthermore, I discussed earlier the larger roster of the AI, and coupled with the ability to print units, allows the AI to outclass the player in numbers and quality, and stop play, force cheese and awkward play from the player. And to explain, my experience was chewing through enemies, resetting with minimum losses, rebuilding my army, attacking again, repeating until defenses and the enemy army had been reduced enough for a final push. This issue existed on a few maps because of max unit cap, and with my chosen faction, I couldn't play and compete with the AI and their stronger and infinite roster. This type of artificial difficulty, this void of balance, creates tedium and frustration. It can be fun to triumph over the director because triumphing over the unfair hardships can be elevating, but ultimately it evolves into constant tedium and bullshit annoyance. The two prior problems combine with game flow to really offend the experience. Warflow, or tug of war as I call it, is the best way to describe Spellforce's gameplay feel. The AI balance and player limitations work together to create a binary warflow: hold and push. To explain, and this might be difficult to comprehend, the AI doesn't need an outpost to play, the player does. Expansion is the key to victory. The player cannot aggressively rush the enemy's econ. They can't actually ever touch the enemy's econ. If the player pushes, it is to take territory for themselves, or to soften the enemy. Some forces don't respond, some do, and the enemy econ is infinite, but does, I think, operate on a timer. So push, rebuild, push, rebuild, push, rebuild can soften and usurp enemy strongholds over time. Furthermore, defense is difficult without proper behaviors and commands. The player's attention must be present to stop the opponent's pushes. So the player must alternate attention between offense and defense. The strategy, the game flow, it's binary. It boils down to building a force both large enough to attack and defend, and pushing only to safely expand, and eventually rush down the OBJ. The available strategy is lacking because player impact is limited by lack of pro on antagonist impact. It forces defensive play because the player is always against the enemy's best. Now, it's not all bad, it is a functional way to design a game. The director exists to tell stories more than to facilitate a fair opponent. The developers opted to tell stories in their campaign over offering a fair contest of strategy, which can't really be a complaint. Ultimately, the major competitive issue might be the AI, which is still fair in versus because all players gotta deal with it. And there's no obvious faction imbalance I can tell. No honest player can print units unfairly. Economy in versus can be attacked, rushed, and tackled in many unique different ways. It's only in campaign that these specific annoyances exist. I think it's critical, though, to remember that Spellforce isn't primarily an RTS or an RPG. It's both, and has split attention for it. It shouldn't be unfairly compared to games like StarCraft or Pathfinder, without this thought in mind. It is well within expectations to acknowledge and accept that the RTS and RPG elements may not compare with the best of the RTS and CRPG genre because of its divided attention. I'm not saying excuse it for its faults, but to instead acknowledge the ambition and appreciate what was done despite its multi-genre limitations. Because it was fun, and I played on normal for all but the last few hours of my 40 hours. I was having fun, I was engaged, I felt accomplished from start to end with every victory. It isn't perfect, but any player should examine and see these faults and measure whether they make or break what is worth celebrating in Spellforce 3, especially because the gameplay isn't even my favorite part. And as for the story, it's easily the best thing the game has on offer. The premise is the prequel, but more so the leading events before the inciting incident of the first game. It's mad compelling, presenting the broken, destroyed, and fragile world of AO as whole, still in conflict with strife but not yet fully shattered, made more interesting by the context of the adventure, predating the game's events and an introduction. Sentenza Noria, commander of Nortander, the human kingdom, is tasked to kill the rebel leader Isamo Tahar. Isamo is the idealistic but evil, powerful man whose own child betrays him to prevent further bloodshed, and that child being saved by Sentenza, that child being you, Tahar, the player, but at the expense of Isamo's escape. And then following that is a time skip. Daddy's dead, the mage wars are over, and Tahar the player is now a veteran of the war, and a seasoned knight or wolf guard. That's the general context for the protagonist, followed by a disease outbreak that quickly escalates into infighting, and regardless of choice puts Tahar on the chopping block, mostly due to circumstance and personal vendettas. From there, it's a prison break gone full epic into a quest to stop the disease and avoid the authorities hot on Tahar's tail. Or at least that's the premise, the early game. It's a strong start. The initial conflict is strong, and there's some layers to it. And Tahar is an interesting protagonist because of their heritage. And a big thing to note here is the handling of the protagonist. Instantly, we get a character that's meant to emulate an actual character, but also serve as a vessel for our influence and choices. Trauma is one of the best vehicles for personal change, or at least for justifying it in writing, and a war against one's parent and constant vindication from one's peers serves to make whoever Tahar was justified in who we make them to be. It's always interesting to see how developers and writers tackle choices, role-playing and protagonist in games. Existing characters are powerful agents and can be successful vessels, but when done poorly, it compromises belief or lacks integrity with choice. Example being non-choices. The Witcher is one of my favorite examples of existing characters being malleable due to detail and careful design. All options and styles in roleplay are Geralt-like. They're all things the character reasonably could do. Nothing stands out as out of character. The player merely pushes his conscience to one action or another, already being weighed in his mind. And Tahar's similar, but very much a different stroke. I'd say Tahar's handled more like Star Wars Knights of the Republic 2's protagonist, the Exile. Using isolation, regret, and trauma to motivate an existing character to completely alter and morph their personality is genius and handled perfectly. Tahar's done likewise, and it defo handles well for it. There's not too much freedom with choices. This is a prequel. Only so much history can be rewritten. But I enjoyed my version of Tahar on display and felt like the player-protagonist experience was handled well. The follow-up to Tahar's performance is the surrounding cast, primarily the main party's displays. There's some strong variety present. Dwarves, orcs, elves, and humans are all featured. The mage, warrior, and rogue aesthetic and more are tapped into. And each character has a long-winded backstory explored through dialogue in pace with the plot's progression. Practically everyone gets screen time, regardless if they're a core contributor or not, and most aren't easy to miss, which is a plus. I'll sample a character with a summary to hopefully hook and display the awesome characters present in the game. Iskrim is a dwarf archaeologist with unique reasons for his passions and for leaving his home, paired with a unique worldview built on his rose-tinted view of ancient civilizations and their practices. I like that his obsessive tendencies are given a lot of attention and his outcast manner isn't done in a demeaning tone. The whole character comes off as a creative going off about a very personal love for a craft or art, even though no one else probably cares. He was mad relatable for his passion and awkward vibes. And then post-party, there's also the factions and their personalities, to include literal characters and the general archetype each faction identifies with. Humans are the generalist, and have some interesting characters in between. They're dominant considering the setting is mostly in the human empire of Nortander. The Keepers display a tad exclusive, i.e. race exclusive, elitist serving a worthy cause, but still deserve criticism for their, bluntly put, racism. There's dissent in the ranks over pro and anti views of their race exclusive tradition, and it's interesting because it isn't overdone, it isn't overly direct, obfuscated by making it an issue of tradition. For more, humans are the entirety of the religious righteous fury fanatics, and y'all know how I feel about hypocrisy, so ultimately there's a few standout zealots, and they do a good job of blending political fervor with religion that makes some major bosses sound like elected officials, with all the twisted non-argument and whatnot speech. This lady straight up monologues nothing at you and then refuses to hear your case, like, okay, death it is. Humans and some are done well enough. They're Mr. Generic for a reason, and the only standouts that I really love have to be the Magic Islanders, who, after escaping human civilization, acknowledge they're better for it and just stay where they're at. Fair, interesting, and I love the decision between the brothers, but I won't spoil. Then the elves are pretty standard Tolkien, sadly. They're magical humans with pointed ears. And here they boil down to exiled elves. In Northander, they're forcefully made refugees over religious persecution, which I think sets a consistent theme between them and their new rulers. Ultimately, they're more ignored than directly oppressed, and their best moments are over them having good intentions mixed with terrible decisions to create dire consequences and conflicts for the player. They're interesting at times, but often, like their rulers, the writers just ignore them. The orcs, or more accurately, the greenskins, are a combination of goblins, ogres, and orcs, possibly more. They live by might makes right, but the twist lies that they value wisdom as much as strength. It's not cowardly to outwit a foe, it's wise, so long as you survive. Their main conflict arises through Gore, who wants to stop infighting and direct their bloodlust against real, outside threats. It tackles natural selection as a method of progress, so long as it's controlled and handled aptly. Constant infighting doesn't sharpen iron, but to strike against their neighbors united will make them keen. I love this tribal approach, especially because it paints their ideology as foreign, but not exactly wrong, merely a different, another approach, which I respect. Overall, they differ enough to have plenty of minor characters to complement their stereotypes, and at least strive for depth with their typical Tolkien likeness. They're not a dark race, born intrinsically evil, they're just different than humans. They facilitate interesting internal conflicts and pose unique reactions to the external antagonist. Plus, the race and faction work well in mirroring writing and playstyle, so it's functional and at times unique. They're more unique than I honestly expected. Overall, there's nothing too standout, but I like to make a note that the inspiration is clear, but also different enough to be interesting. I'm on the side of being completely unique or incredibly faithful to inspiration, and I believe Spellforce strikes a nice balance with these races and people, being faithful to their origins, but also unique enough to maintain interest. But that's mostly where the Tolkien comparisons end. For the first half of the game, it's very grounded with the conflicts and subject matter. Mostly it focuses on war, human conflict, and the arguments surrounding said topic. Predating the primary plot is the Mage Wars waged by Isamo Tahar, which serves as the setup for further major discussions. Effectively, when mages fight a war for their superiority, lose, and still live next to the people they ravaged, it leads to some backlash. It feels very World War I commentary on how Germany was handled. Next, the response from those affected people is to rally under the banner of the purity. I wonder who that could be, referencing cough cough, Puritans cough cough. Under the guidance of Lacane, they preach that the world must be cleansed of magic users in order to bring back Aeonir, basically Jesus of Ao, and the way they remove magic from the users is a spell ritual thing that can work or might melt the user's mage brain. So it isn't humane, and it only gets worse with time and growing further as the plot progresses. It does a decent job commentating on the effects of war, especially in terms of repercussions and how war breeds yet more war and hate. It touches on how good intentions blinded by faith can lead to genuine hypocrisy and death and destruction on an epic scale. And the twist, the charm of the story is mostly due to the surprise, the subject matter, and the personal stakes present. Spoilers, real short, the entire first half of the game is about finding the source of the bloodburn and avoiding the authorities, the bloodburn being the disease, all while being secretly aided and directed by the purity leader Lacane. The twist of the game is that the ancient race of Shapers, well, there's one in your father's lab. Her efforts to call you to help her escape has accidentally caused the bloodburn. Furthermore, she's your magical artificial mother because of your father and his experience. This actually explains a lot of questions in the first act that could have been plot holes otherwise, and I really like the twist because it's functional and entertaining. Then, before you escape, Lacane shoves her soul into an amulet and then tries to kill you, but your mother had awakened new powers in you, so you survive, get an extra set of abilities in one of your 3 classes, and now you have to go stop Lacane. Also, at the very end, something, but not Aeonir, was directing him. He believed God was directing him, but in truth, it was a cosmic horror that almost destroyed the world. Blind faith and its consequences strike yet again. And that's Spellforce 3's plot. It almost feels trivial to unpack because it depends so heavily on the emotional investment. All of the conflicts hinge on moral dilemmas that can be logistically tackled, but the real impact doesn't come from is this right or wrong, but what do my companions feel about it, and what are the consequences with that relationship over this decision of what is right and wrong. I don't think it's nearly as impactful. So it provides logos and pathos to amplify each event and choice's intended effect. So on paper, I don't think it's nearly as impactful, but in practice, I was invested and truly cared about each and every character. They motivated the plot, the whole game, honestly. My only real last complaint was the shift from grounded conflicts to one established on mythos. Lacane was insane in my headcanon because that's the more deliberate and realistic truth to Zealots. I just prefer focusing on the human element and prefer some answers to be less cosmic and more inexplicably and unexplainably human. So if I didn't make it apparent, I really enjoyed Spellforce III Reforged, and I do in fact want to continue the journey I've started. It had its ups and downs, but overall played wonderfully. However, according to what I researched, I divulged from the community, they think I've started in a fairly piss-poor place to tackle the universe. And don't get me wrong, 3 and its expansions are the best place to start for a one-and-done experience. Yet going from the pristine Spellforce 3 to the much older 2 or 1 is a difficult jump technically. They're old and outdated games, it's just the truth. But in Universe Timeline it dictates 3, 1, 2, and each of their expansions post each play, apart from Fallen God, which is a standalone, but whatever. I can't play chronologically for release dates since I started with 3, but the in-universe start is, and that might just be for now, Spellforce 3, so I can still go in at least some kind of order for the future. And that's all to say, I'm not fully sated, but I do want a break if I'm capable. No promises. I want to tackle and personally witness the full story of the first trilogy and AO. So take my word with a grain of salt, but the next Spellforce title might be a hopefully shorter piece on Spellforce 3 DLC Soul Harvest. And I know I was really critical of this video, but the truth is I had a lot of fun. I think it had a lot of problems, but what it's doing is so unique, innovative, and some of the ideas present are just hard to put on paper because of their emotional weight, and measuring that is kind of impossible for me. But I want to say that at the end of the day, if you can view all of these problems as minor stepping stones and hop over them and enjoy the game, do so, because it fucks real good. Anyway, I decided to go off script there at the bottom, so stay safe, y'all. We are gaming.